Welcome to our channel, The World of Evil Spirits. If this is your first visit, hello, I am David, the owner of this place. Please come in, I will take you to the world of ghostly horror spiritual stories. How will today's story unfold? Please, pay attention to follow right after this. Kwai Village is a small village that has existed for a long time, located on the banks of the Red River. Because of its geographical location next to a large river and facing the sea, most of the villagers are fishermen. This land is closely connected to rivers, and spiritual stories related to rivers are not uncommon. Many years ago, the villagers were still very poor. Although electricity, roads, schools and stations were developed in many places, Kauai village was still deserted, with only a few yellow lights flickering, and the roads were bumpy dirt roads with many potholes. In general, the people's living conditions were very poor, from the infrastructure to the food and clothing. That year, people were rushing to announce the situation of storm number 7 that was about to make landfall. According to the forecast of the hydrometeorological station, storm number 7 was predicted to be the biggest storm in the past 15 years. In the small tiled house located right in the middle of the village was the home of Mr. Lunas, the village chief. Inside the house, the hissing sound of a black and white TV was heard. Mr. Lunas was sitting in front of a dinner tray. On the TV screen was a weather forecast program. While eating, Mr. Lunas worriedly talked to his wife. "Why are there so many storms this year, Mom? If this keeps up, our people will suffer again this year." Mr. Lunas's wife, Mrs. Luna, was sitting and rocking her grandson, James, to sleep. When her husband asked, she turned to him and replied, "Oh my gosh, it's always stormy. Have you tied up the newspaper yet? The storm is coming tonight. If you're not careful, the wind might blow the whole house away. Remember to charge your flashlight, because the electricity is going to be cut off soon." The conversation between the couple continued until the lights in the room suddenly went out. The night was stormy and windy. Mr. Lunas's door was tied very tightly, but occasionally the wind blew so hard that it shook violently. Perhaps because the wind was too strong, the door could not bear it and flew open. Mr. Lunas rushed to pull the door tightly, trying to secure it from the outside. The rain got heavier and heavier, and the wind also grew stronger and stronger. After a few minutes of trying, Mr. Lunas secured the door firmly. Mr. Lunas's whole body was now soaked from the rain that had splashed in earlier. He changed his clothes and tiredly returned to bed. After a while, Mr. Lunas gradually fell asleep. Suddenly, a girl's figure appeared outside the yard. Her voice echoed inside the house. "Save me. Can someone save me? I'm cold out here. Open the door and let me in." The girl's voice echoed outside the yard. Mr. Lunas heard the cry for help and asked, "Whose daughter are you? Why are you standing out there in the rain and storm at night? Go home, it's dangerous outside." The girl suddenly raised her hands to cover her face and cried. Her mournful cries echoed as if they were about to pierce deep into the listener's head. Mr. Lunas spoke up to calm her down. You don't have to cry. If not, you can come to my house and take shelter." The girl looked up at Mr. Lunas. Her crying suddenly changed to cold laughter. She looked at Mr. Lunas with a cold gaze and asked again, "Are you telling the truth? So you agree to let me stay in your house, right?" As soon as she finished speaking, the girl's face suddenly appeared with disgusting blotches, rotting flesh on one side, her pupils falling out, dangling from her cheekbones. Mr. Lunas saw that scene and felt so weak that he could not speak. Suddenly, a child's voice rang out, startling him awake, knowing that he had just experienced a nightmare. Mr. Lunas tiredly crawled out of bed, went to the table, took a puff of his pipe to calm himself down. Suddenly, little James burst into tears in the middle of the night, and Mrs. Luna had to get up to comfort her grandson. After a while, the boy's crying gradually stopped. He sniffled and said, "Grandma, there's a lady who keeps forcing me to go outside. That lady has very long arms. Her arms are reaching through the window to the bed and pulling my legs. I'm so scared, Grandma. Hearing her grandson say that, Mrs. Luna was a bit scared, but she still tried to act like nothing happened and comforted her grandson. Little James snuggled into Mrs. Luna's arms and continued to sleep. Mr. Luna sat and listened to the whole conversation between the two of them. He remembered the dream he had just had about a girl standing in the yard. Feeling that this was not a coincidence, Mr. Lunas immediately turned to the ancestral altar and lit incense and prayed, "I beg you, the gods are here. Our family has not done anything to you. I hope you will forgive us. Namo Amitabha Buddha." After burning incense, Mr. Lunas was allowed to return to bed. The rain outside had lessened, and the wind was no longer howling as before. It seemed that the storm had passed. Mr. Lunas was finally able to sleep peacefully, and the house gradually returned to silence. Early the next morning, while the villagers were still cleaning up the battlefield after the storm, from the beginning of the village, people heard a panicked shout. "Oh, my village! Someone died! Someone died! People, there's a murder! Uncle Lunas, there's a murder! Uncle Lunas, village chief!" Mr. Lunas was busy cleaning the yard when he heard that and quickly asked, "What's the matter, Anna?" Anna's face was pale now. She was panting and stuttering. There's someone dead, Uncle Lunas. There's someone dead outside the river fork. If you run out there, you'll see it right away." Mrs. Anna quickly led Mr. Lunas away. Hearing the commotion, the villagers rushed out to see what was happening. There were already a lot of people outside the river junction. In the middle of the river, there was a girl's body floating, bloated and smelling, entangled in a tree branch. Mr. Lunas saw this scene and immediately sent someone to the commune committee to call the authorities to come down and investigate. The villagers stood around, watching and gossiping. Very quickly, the police and the committee arrived at the scene. The girl's body was brought ashore for examination right in front of everyone. The village chief, Mr. Lunas, and the people involved followed the police to the commune to take statements. It was not until late afternoon that everything was resolved. It was almost dusk when Mr. Lunas returned home. Mrs. Luna asked curiously, "How is it, sir? Is everything out there settled?" Mr. Lunas recounted, "The police have just taken statements, but the situation is not clear yet. We will know when the identities are confirmed. It will probably take a few more days to resolve." That night, when the villagers had fallen asleep, a girl's wailing could be heard at the crossroads. At the same time, in the distance on the dirt road, a man's figure suddenly appeared. It was Old Steve of the whole Kauai village. Everyone knew Old Steve because he was famous for being a drunkard. All day long, he was never sober. He always held a bottle of rice wine in his hand, and he drank it every step he took. Tonight, he went to a wedding in the next village, so he just came back now. As he was passing by the river fork, he suddenly saw a girl standing by the road, covering her face and crying. Curious, he approached her and asked, "Hey girl, why are you standing by the river crying so loudly after not staying home all night? Be careful not to be dragged into the river by the ghost. This morning, we just recovered the body of a drowned girl. Let's go home." Old Steve grumbled and turned to leave, his legs dangling from side to side, then from side to side. He hadn't gone a few steps when a voice rang out from behind, carrying a cold wind that blew straight into Old Steve's neck, causing him to hiccup a few times. "Don't go. Stay here with me. It's cold here today. Stay here with me." Old Steve staggered back to look at the girl. Because he was drunk, his eyes were now closed. He didn't know when the girl had stood right in front of Old Steve. Her voice was full of charm. "Don't go back. Stay here and play with me. I have a lot of good wine. You can drink as much as you want." As if possessed by a demon, the wine bottle in Old Steve's hand fell to the ground. He was stunned like a lost soul, slowly following the girl, walking all the way down to the river, his whole body gradually sinking below the surface of the water. At the same time, Anna's son Drew was sleeping when he suddenly heard a voice calling, "Drew, Drew, come out here and play with me." Hearing someone calling him, Drew woke up with a start. He went to the window, looked outside, and asked, "Who is it? What are you looking for me for at this time of night?" The girl's voice once again rang out outside the gate. "It's me. Come out and play." In the dark night, the silhouette of a girl gradually appeared. She was wearing a long white dress. Her face was concave and convex, with sagging flesh that seemed about to fall to the ground. Drew was startled when he saw that. Realizing that what he saw was a ghost, he quickly slammed the window shut and ran straight to bed, covering himself tightly with the blanket, not daring to breathe heavily. Outside, the girl's voice was still ringing, along with the sound of footsteps getting closer and closer to the window. "Drew, open the door and let me in. It's so cold out here." Drew was so scared that he was shaking like a leaf. He covered his ears with both hands, but the voice still penetrated deep into his mind. Suddenly, the window shook. The sound of banging on the door terrified Drew. He curled up in the corner of the bed, not daring to open his eyes to look. Tears streamed down his face. He muttered, "Go away, go away, go away." The window shook more and more violently until it burst open. The witch pressed her face against the window and pointed at Drew. Lunace's eyes bulged. Why didn't you save me that day? Why? Because of you, my mother and I had to die. I killed you. I killed you." After finishing her sentence, the witch reached her 2 long arms through the window frame and strangled Drew. Being strangled, Drew tried to struggle to escape but couldn't. His arms and legs were powerless and he couldn't move. Just as he gave up and waited for death, he suddenly woke up. It turned out that what he had just experienced was just a nightmare. Remembering what the witch had said in his dream, Drew sat on the bed, absent-mindedly thinking until the next morning. Anna's voice resounded throughout the village. "Hey, villagers, someone died again. Hey, villagers." Mr. Lunas was still busy cleaning the house because he had to go to the committee to take statements all day yesterday and had not had time to clean up when he heard Anna's screams again. Old Steve's body had now floated up from the water and was lying exactly where the girl had died yesterday. The only thing was that because he had just died, his body had not decomposed as horribly as the girl's. Seeing that scene, the people around him were even more heatedly talking. "Oh no, it looks like old Steve was taken away by the spirit of the girl who died yesterday. This place might become a curse, then you'd be in trouble, folks. See, I told you yesterday, young women and girls who die young are very sacred. Young boys in the village should be careful when going there. If they are in harmony with their spirits, they will take them away, which is dangerous. Of course, there are also many atheists who do not believe in ghosts and think it is just a normal accident. Many times, old Steve got so drunk that he fell into the river with his eyes half closed and drowned. The police and the committee came to block off the scene. After the investigation, it was concluded that old Steve was really drunk and fell into the river and drowned. Old Steve's body was then returned to his family to complete the funeral. Within 2 days, 2 people died at the same place, which haunted the villagers. Many people passing by the river junction felt a chill. They told each other that the river was now haunted and that whoever walked home at night would be led into the river and drowned. Because of these rumors, fewer people passed by, and they accepted to take a detour, even though the distance was much longer. But in return, they felt safe. Ever since the girl's body was recovered, people would often hear mournful cries at the river junction every night, and sometimes screams, but no one would dare to get curious and approach. For many days in a row, the whole village was talking about the strange things happening at the river junction. Mrs. Luna heard the rumors and became curious, so she asked her husband how he planned to solve this problem. Mr. Lunas was sitting and playing with little James on a hammock when his wife asked him. He sighed and said, "I've been having a headache for the past few days. I don't know how to solve it anymore. Should I invite a priest to set up an altar to worship the dead?" In this modern and developed country, We can't continue to be superstitious like this. Seeing that her husband was upset, Mrs. Luna didn't ask any more questions. She sighed and went down to the kitchen to cook rice. It was getting dark now. Little James was sitting on the bed, playing with some toys that his parents had brought back from the city last month. He suddenly stared outside and pointed, saying, "Grandpa, there's someone walking back and forth in the yard." Mr. Lunas looked outside, but saw no one in the yard, only the occasional motorbike passing by, probably passers-by. "You sit here and play. I'll go to the kitchen to see if Grandma's done cooking so we can serve dinner." Mr. Lunas put little James down on the bed and went to the kitchen. Little James's eyes were still curiously looking out the gate. In front of him at this moment was the shadow of a girl smiling at him and waving. "James, come out here and play with me. I'll give you some candy." Little James got out of bed and walked to the front door, but he didn't dare go out. He stood there, looking at the girl and shaking his head. A moment later, Mrs. Luna came up from the kitchen. Seeing little James standing outside the door, Mr. Lunas picked him up and carried him into the house. That night, Mr. Lunas had another dream. In his dream, he saw a girl standing in the yard, looking at him and crying. Seeing this, Mr. Lunas asked, "Girl, why are you standing in my yard crying? Is something wrong?" The girl looked up at Mr. Lunas and replied, "I died in the cold river. I want to go home. Please help me go home." In his mind, Mr. Lunas had not thought that this girl was dead. Seeing someone in need of help, he asked, "Where do you live so I can take you home?" The girl pointed in a direction and said, "My house is far away, all the way over there." Following the girl's pointing finger, Mr. Lunas suddenly thought of the river fork. Suddenly, he realized that the face belonged to the girl who had died at the river fork a few days ago. At this moment, Mr. Lunas suddenly realized that the girl standing in front of him was no longer human. Mr. Lunas trembled and said, You're dead. Why are you here? What do you want from our village?" The witch laughed coldly at Luna. She looked at Mr. Lunas with a threatening gaze and roared, "What do you want? Of course I want you to worship me. Otherwise, I will capture you all, one by one." Laughing, the ghost's body twisted. Her face that had been normal just a moment ago was now covered in disgusting flesh. The flesh was falling apart, pulling patches of skin down to her neck. Mr. Lunas woke up with a start, gasping for breath, his heart pounding as if it was about to jump out of his chest. Little James was sleeping soundly when he suddenly woke up and cried. It took him an hour of coaxing before he would fall back asleep. For the next few days, every night at 3 a.m., James would burst into tears and wouldn't say anything when asked. At Drew's house that night, he was sleeping in his room when he suddenly woke up. At the same time, he heard footsteps as if someone was walking towards him. When he got to the door, the footsteps suddenly stopped and then stopped. Recalling the old dream, Drew immediately turned pale. Before he could regain his composure, he discovered that there was a girl standing right next to the bed. Drew trembled all over, holding the blanket in front of him and stammering, You, please forgive me, I beg you, please forgive me, don't look for me anymore, don't look for me anymore." Suddenly the witch jumped onto the bed and pressed down on Drew. He was speechless. After a while, his whole body became numb, as if he had lost his soul. He looked around absent-mindedly. At this moment, Drew seemed to have turned into a different person. He sat on the bed, raised his hand, and scratched his face, causing his face to be full of scratches and bleeding. While scratching Drew, Luna laughed and said coldly, "It's so itchy. It's all over my face. It's so itchy. It's so itchy." The more Drew talked, the harder he scratched, and blood covered all 10 fingers. His silly laughter continued to resound on the bed until the next morning. Mr. Lunas was sitting eating his bowl of noodles when Fat Anna ran over from somewhere and shouted, Mr. Lunas, please quickly charge me. What's wrong with Drew?" Mr. Lunas has been constantly bothered by Anna these past few days," he replied, a little unhappily. What's wrong with this girl again? Every time I see her, I get scared. Mrs. Anna sat down on Mr. Lunas's porch and cried. My son Drew, I don't know what happened to him, but he just sat there in his room, laughing like he was crazy, and then he scratched his whole body and face. My husband and I tried everything to wake him up, but it didn't work. Uncle, please come over and help me and my husband. If anything happens to him, I probably won't be able to live. Mr. Lunas heard Anna's story and understood a bit of the situation. Okay, stop crying and making a fuss. Let me go to your house to see what's going on. Everything was fine. How could it suddenly turn out like this? Mr. Lunas then followed Anna to her house. Drew's condition was more serious than Anna had said. As soon as he arrived, Mr. Lunas saw Drew holding a knife in his hand, slashing at the door and cursing loudly. I'll slash you all to death. I'll slash you all. Fat Anna saw her son like that and became even more panicked and cried louder. She trembled and approached her son, trying to beg him. Drew, listen to me and put down the knife. I beg you, Drew. Drew turned to look at Anna with cold eyes. He turned his head and pointed the knife at Anna and shouted loudly, You are not my mother. Get lost. Get lost. Mum, I hate her. I hate all of you. You were the ones who wronged me first. After saying that, Drew turned around and jumped quickly towards the window. He climbed from the window and then climbed straight up to the roof. His whole body was dangling back and forth on the roof, looking exactly like a monkey. Despite the screams of Anna and her husband and the neighbors around, Drew didn't even bother to pee. He sat there scratching. Itchy, so itchy, itchy, so itchy. While he wasn't paying attention, Mr. Tony, Drew's father, had secretly climbed onto the roof. He crept up behind his son. Waiting for Drew to not notice, Mr. Tony quickly rushed forward, grabbed his neck and pushed him down, pressing him down so he couldn't move. The young men who were waiting quickly climbed onto the roof of the outhouse. Mr. Tony held Drew back. Mr. Lunas had to tie Drew up with a rope. His face was red, his eyes were darting around, glancing at Mr. Lunas's group. Then he bared his teeth and cursed profusely. He also ran out, Let me go, let me go. I have to go home, I have to go home. Mr. Lunas walked up to Drew and asked, Calm down, do you recognize me? Drew looked at Mr. Lunas and laughed loudly, then said, You village chief Lunas, I told you, better let me go or I'll kill your whole village. After saying that, Drew tensed up and shook a few times before passing out. Mr. Lunas patted his face and called him a few more times, but he didn't move. Mr. Lunas turned to Anna and Mr. Tony and said, He's passed out. Let him rest first. Don't untie him for now, or he'll wake up and do something bad. Just keep an eye on his health. If he doesn't get better, wait until he goes to the hospital soon. Following Mr. Lunas's instructions, Mrs. Anna and Mr. Tony helped Drew into bed to rest. The neighbors who were eavesdropping saw that there was nothing more to say, so they left one by one. At this time, only Mr. Tony and his wife, Mr. Lunas, and a few young men remained in the house. Mr. Lunas turned to Mr. Tony and his wife and asked, How long has he been like this? Has he had this condition before? Mrs. Anna sat down on the bed with tears streaming down her face and looked at her son and said, It's so hard, Uncle Lunas. My son has never been like this before. I'm afraid he's going crazy and will die. Mr. Tony seemed calmer than Mrs. Anna. He invited Mr. Lunas and the young men to sit in the living room and have a drink. Then he began to tell the story. This morning, Mrs. Anna went to Drew's room to wake him up for school. As soon as she stood in front of the door, she smelled the smell of blood. Mrs. Anna was so scared that she ran quickly to the bed where Drew was lying. That was also when she discovered Drew, half crazy, sitting on the bed, laughing to himself. His hand kept scratching his face. The wound was so deep that the blood on his face and nose flowed down and wet his collar. "Mrs." Anna screamed. Mr. Tony heard the noise and ran over. The couple jumped in to stop their son but couldn't. His strength was too strong, so Anna went to Mr. Loomis for help. This was very confusing. Not knowing why Drew was so mad, there must be a problem. Mr. Tony and Mrs. Anna both had the same thought. Although he always said that the country was in a period of reform and had to eliminate superstitious practices, Mr. Loomis was a person of the previous generation, so he still paid attention to spiritual matters. Drew's expression just now was very much like being possessed. At the same time, Drew started to regain consciousness inside the house. Seeing that, both Mr. Tony and Mr. Loomis quickly went inside to check on the situation. Then everyone started asking him if he remembered what had happened. But Drew shook his head, bewildered. He held his head in pain and replied, I don't remember anything. My head hurts so much, Mum and Dad." Seeing that, no one dared to ask any more questions. Mr. Loomis and the young men said goodbye to Mr. Tony and left together. On the way back, Mr. Loomis kept thinking about Drew. He seemed to feel something familiar in his actions, but he couldn't explain where that familiarity came from. Returning home, Mr. Loomis looked around, but couldn't see where Mrs. Luna and James were. He looked at the clock and saw that it was almost 10 o'clock in the morning. Remembering that there was a meeting scheduled outside the commune this morning, Mr. Loomis hurriedly put on his pith helmet and rode his bicycle away. The way to the commune had to go through a river junction. Although Mr. Loomis was not a timid person, when cycling past this place, he could not help but feel a little chilly. Ever since the incident of 2 people drowning in the river, the villagers had been spreading rumors. One told 10, 10 told 100. Some believed it, some did not. But in the end, people still had the idea of, let's just take another road for safety. Who knows, it might be unlucky. Therefore, most people avoided the road across the river junction, which was why the surrounding scenery was unusually deserted, only occasionally seeing the silhouettes of 1 or 2 people. Mr. Loomis cycled very fast straight towards the commune committee. In the evening of the same day, Mrs. Helen in the village went to the field to clean up the fields. Because the grass had not been cleared for a long time, it had grown very thick, so Mrs. Helen had to try to finish until dusk before leisurely riding her rickety bicycle. Her whole body was tired. Mrs. Helen strained her body to cycle home. Usually, every time she went home, Mrs. Helen took a detour and did not dare to go through the river junction. But today, because it was late and no one at home had cooked, Mrs. Helen felt sorry for herself, so she took a risk and cycled across the river junction to get home quickly. Everything was going fine until they got close to the river junction. Mrs. Helen's heart started pounding. She held her breath and tried to pedal as fast as she could, not daring to look around because she believed in ghosts pulling people. Then, right when the bike reached the river junction, a voice rang out, "Is that Mrs. Helen? Where have you been?" Helen felt like her heart was going to burst out. She didn't know who was calling her, so she looked around to see who it was, but she couldn't see anyone at all. Helen suspected that she was being teased by a ghost, so she quickly cycled away even faster. Suddenly, that voice rang out again. "Helen, where are you going so fast? Stay and play with me. I'm so bored out here. Helen, stay here with me." This time, Mrs. Helen felt as if someone was standing right next to her ear and talking to her. Mrs. Helen trembled and looked behind her. Her eyes rolled back, because right behind her, a girl had appeared squatting on the back seat. She looked at Mrs. Helen and then smiled coldly. Mrs. Helen was shocked, so scared that she didn't have time to think. She threw away her bike and ran away, screaming, "Oh my gosh, help me! There's a ghost! There's a ghost! Help me!" Mrs. Helen screamed loudly, closing her eyes and running until she bumped into something and fell to the ground. At the same time, the man's voice rang out, "Mrs. Helen, what are you doing running like a ghost?" It turned out that Mrs. Helen had bumped into Mr. Loomis. Hearing the familiar voice, Mrs. Helen looked up and recognized the village chief. She sobbed and said, Uncle Lunas, please save me. There's a ghost at the river fork. It was sitting right behind my bike and asked me to stay and play with it, Uncle Lunas. I'm so scared. Mr. Lunas had just returned from a meeting in the commune when he heard someone screaming behind him. He stopped to see what was going on, but he didn't expect that person to be his neighbor, Mrs. Helen. Seeing Mrs. Helen's pale face, Mr. Lunas spoke up to reassure her. It's okay. Take my car first, and I'll go back to the river fork to get your car back. And are you okay? I've been around there for a few times now, and I haven't seen any ghosts or demons out there. Hearing that, Mrs. Helen nodded in agreement immediately, as if she was still not over her fear. She stammered to tell Mr. Lunas, Uncle, must remember to be careful. Okay, I saw the ghost female, clearly. That, after saying a few words, Mrs. Helen got on her bike and sped home, while Mr. Lunas walked towards the river junction. When he got there, he saw the bicycle lying on the road. Mr. Lunas shook his head and went to put the bike up. Before leaving, Mr. Lunas did not forget to look back around one more time, but he still did not see anything strange here. The sound of the bicycle clattered again. Mr. Lunas's figure went further and further away and then disappeared. There was one thing that Mr. Lunas did not know, which was that right behind him, on the bicycle seat, there was the shadow of a girl sitting there, watching Mr. Lunas's back. As time went by, the rumor about the female ghost at the river junction that teased people showed no signs of cooling down. People said that the female ghost that scared Mrs. Helen was the first girl to die there. After the day Drew went crazy, Mr. and Mrs. Tony paid a lot of attention to him. After a while, when they saw that he was normal, they were a little less worried. But then one night, Drew started laughing alone in his room until the next morning, while Mrs. Anna was still half asleep. Things started to change on Drew's side. His loud laughter echoed through Lunas's room. Mr. Tony and Mrs. Anna didn't dare to enter their son's room. This time, they had experience, so they locked the door from the outside to prevent him from going out. Seeing that he was locked up, Drew immediately protested, smashing and cursing profanely. Seeing that things were not going well, Mr. Tony ordered Mrs. Anna to guard the door while he ran over to call Mr. Lunas. Because they had prepared in advance, Mr. Lunas and Mr. Tony rushed straight to the house of a shaman named Jean. I heard that this man was very skilled and very good at treating spiritual illnesses. After inviting the shaman back, Mr. Tony dared to open the door to let the shaman into Drew's room. At that time, Drew was still screaming and smashing things. Sometimes he cursed, sometimes he begged, sometimes he screamed in pain. Mrs. Anna looked at her son being tortured and cried with tears streaming down her face. The surrounding villagers came to watch, filling Mr. Tony's yard. After more than 2 hours, Mr. Jean came out of Drew's room and said, "This boy was robbed by a spirit. This spirit is a female spirit who drowned at the river junction nearby. I talked to her, and she said that when she was alive, a boy tricked her into getting pregnant and then denied it. Her parents cursed and beat her when they found out. The girl was so miserable that she jumped into the river and committed suicide near the bridge in town. The water carried her body to Kauai village. That day, this boy happened to be passing by and heard someone calling for help, but he didn't see anyone, so he left. That's why the female spirit followed him and haunted him. The story was told that she died but didn't save her. Now that I've captured that girl's spirit, everyone can rest assured that nothing will happen again. Okay, the family can go in and let her rest." Hearing Mr. Jean speak up to here, everyone understood the problem. Mrs. Anna and Mr. Tony bowed their heads in thanks. From that day on, the spiritual stories surrounding the river junction no longer happened. The people of Kauai village gradually returned to their peaceful lives, and people coming and going at the river junction were bustling again. Everything passed by as if nothing had ever happened, and today's story ends here. Thank you all for listening and following. If you have any thoughts or feelings, please leave your comments. Now, goodbye, and see you again. I hope you have a good night's sleep. See you again on the next broadcast on our channel.